The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and families and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is Representative Steve Kelley, 44th District, Hopkins. He'll be talking with Mary Treacy, Director of Metronet, the multi-type library system for the metropolitan area. They'll be discussing recent legislative initiatives focusing on technology and ways that children and families can become information literate. Steve and Mary, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and we've got rather a massive topic to talk about: information technology, information literacy. And the reason that you're here, Representative Kelley, is because you have introduced some very major legislation during the 1995 Minnesota legislature, and you had some rather amazing success. You've also been very interested in linking libraries into the world of technology. Describe some of the things that happened and the reaction of your colleagues when you really started working on these issues.
Well, one of the things that I thought was important was that as we move into an information age where people's access to wealth was going to depend on their access to information, we needed to figure out a way to bring information to people who couldn't afford it. And the best public institutions that we have for doing that are the schools and the libraries. So in the 1995 session, one of the bills that I sponsored was designed to provide more state funding for libraries and schools so that they could invest in computers and information technology and bring all of the wide sources of electronic information into schools and into libraries so that people who can't afford to have a computer in their home could get access to those sources of information.
And that's, of course, something, Mary, that is director of Metronet, which is a multi-type library organization working with schools, public libraries, academic and special. Information literacy and collaboration among these kinds of libraries has been real important. So it's a natural for you and Steve to be talking about these issues at a really policy-making level. It's changing the way all of us are doing business.
And I think it's important to understand and to think about the fact that when libraries are the point of access, that they've assumed a real responsibility in that. And so it's not as if you were doing the libraries a favor, you're really working through the libraries to assume information responsibility in a community. And it's a heavy responsibility. Bringing information literacy, information awareness into a community is whether the community is a school or a town, you're assuming a major responsibility.
One of the things you talked about, Steve, was access for people who may not be familiar with technology, and I think a lot of the buzzwords that we use, the superhighway and even access to information, people say, well, what does that mean, and what does that mean for me? And it kind of turns around into an almost fear. Sometimes in the library we see people coming in and not even wanting to touch the terminals and kind of wistfully talking about the card catalog, but they wouldn't go to the supermarket and expect the clerk to be checking out without those lasers. And I think that you're bringing it down to a real level. You're not just talking in broad terms that people don't understand.
Well, I think that fear does exist. On the other hand, there are some great stories out there. This week, the St. Paul Pioneer Press ran a story about Access Minnesota, which is a University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Extension Service received a $400,000 grant from the federal government to provide terminals and access to the internet in counties throughout Minnesota. And one of the leads in the story was this retired gentleman who lived on a farm in northern Minnesota who would drive into the Extension Service office and log on to the internet there, and his attitude was that this was a part of his ongoing learning, and emphasized the point that he thought that learning didn't stop, and this was his way of doing that.
Well, and that's lifelong learning is something that...
A related story is that another thing that happened this week was the first kind of groundbreaking for the senior net at Minneapolis Community College, and based on exactly that same principle. So.
One of the things that fascinates me, though, is your legislation really, in a very nice way, not only encouraged but forced libraries and schools to talk to each other. And was that hard? I know the Minnesota legislature has really focused on collaboration for a number of years, but do you find the lobbyists from the various organizations resisting that, or have associations and special interest groups, if you want to think of librarians and teachers as special interests, have they come to recognize that the only way this is going to be successful is breaking down those barriers and those turf ideas?
Gretchen, I think that more public institutions of all kinds are aware that in order to maintain the level of service and be more effective in serving their customers or citizens, they need to collaborate with each other. And libraries have been doing that with each other, and in some cases with schools for a long time. So within the education library community, that wasn't too hard to do. The difficulty comes in, it was also easy because they're both funded by the same committee in the legislature, so everybody was sort of there in the same room at the same time. The hard part for collaboration on this will come with trying to get city governments and county governments to participate in these collaboratives along with schools and libraries. And I think there are places around the state that want to do that, but given the fact that the funding comes from different areas in the legislature, it's harder to coordinate that at the state level.
The massive, Hennepin County is involved in a whole redesign initiative, which is intended to make services for families less fragmented, to break down barriers. And it's interesting to see social service in schools and the library's involvement along with this sort of thing. Hennepin County Library did receive a collaborative grant, and we're working with the redesign initiative, and in an attempt to make library services more real and more accessible for people who may not use them, we're putting our online terminals with CD-ROM capabilities in locations away from the library, and one of them is going to be in your district at the Hopkins Area Family Resource Center, and that's 2 blocks from the public library. But as Nora Davis at the Resource Center said, that's the longest 2 blocks in the world. If you have problems reading, if English is not your primary language, if you've never been in a library, because for some reason we're real scary. So is this the kind of collaboration that you see the library working with the Resource Center, working with the Hopkins schools, and the City Council becoming involved in this sort of?
I think that's what's desirable. One of the interesting things that's happening in Minnesota is that communities are coming together to say that we see it as a problem if we're not on the information superhighway, if we don't have a ramp coming into our town. So the business community, the public institutions, libraries, and a variety of other groups in towns all over the state are coming together to define what their needs are and then try to communicate that to the information and other service providers, the telephone company or the cable company or whatever. And I think that's a very positive trend because it lets the community define what its needs are and then say, here's how we'd like the infrastructure built.
That's kind of a new idea, isn't it, for the legislature? I mean, traditionally, haven't elected officials often said, this is what you need to do, and this whole idea of letting the grassroots folks decide, decentralization, where's the accountability coming in if you don't have all these rules?
Well, I think we have to get used to the idea that local voters have to hold their local officials accountable, but it's also a new idea for the service providers too. US West has gotten used to saying, we'll design the service and then we'll see who buys it, and instead we're getting this process that works the other way around, where the community is designing the service and then saying who's going to provide us with this service. And it's putting some different kinds of pressures on the on the large corporations that provide these services.
Well, or the institutions, Mary. Certainly we in the library world, the public library world anyway, haven't been very good at talking to members of our community. We have always known what's best for them.
Well, and what's happening now with the telecommunications, the wires, is going to happen with the information more and more, where people are going to say, this is the information we really need, or this is the information we're producing that we want you to share. And that, I think we're going to start thinking about the people not as recipients of the information only, but as producers of information.
And I think that's really important, because the model that people first started talking about when they were talking about the information superhighway was that you were going to have 500 channels of cable TV coming into your home, and they didn't talk about the home or the people living there as being sources of information. And I think it's real important from a community or policy perspective that we figure out how to ensure that people can be producers or publishers of information, not just passive recipients of information.
But then kind of to play the devil's advocate role, we in the library rely very heavily on reviews, on people's credentials, on the accuracy of information, or at least being able to know where an author is coming from. So if you don't agree, you understand where the bias is. What's going to happen with that?
Well, I think people will figure out ways to do that in the same way that, for example, you find one magazine that collects writers that you are more sympathetic with or more interested in reading, or one newspaper that you particularly like to read over another one. Will find websites that are where the sponsors are better at identifying people to add to their website compared to other folks. And so there'll be people out there that play the role of organizer or screener of information, and each person who looks for it will have to decide which one they like.
And that's the way you look for information or books in the library.
Information literacy is all about, is that people do take individual information responsibility, and that's why we need to be attending in the schools, not just to having the hardware, but to teaching people how to.
I think you said the magic word. Hardware is a lot easier to deal with than the software and the ideas, and for many of us, there is this passion, or we've got to get the CD-ROM players. We have to be linked up. We have to have the wires. We have to schlep the materials around. And I think as a library profession, perhaps we are not talking enough about the kinds of services. We've got to change the way we work with the people who use our libraries. And this is a real hard concept. It's much easier to talk about needing money for those things that plug in. And as you develop this legislation, were you involved in any discussions like that?
Well, I agree with you that it is a lot easier to talk about the things that you can see or touch as things that you should provide money for. Talking about the software and the content is a lot harder, and it's more difficult to get legislators interested in supporting that, because one of the things I worked on besides the bill that was successful, which provided money for connecting schools and libraries in the state, with essentially money for more hardware, more wires, was a bill that would have created an institute that would work on the applications and the education of people about how to use all these new information resources that would have involved libraries and school teachers and a variety of information providers. And that was a lot tougher to talk to people about.
Well, and I think we need some help in learning how to collaborate and how to do that kind of teaching, because again, we're good at giving instructions, but we're not always as good as we could be in helping. And I think it's probably because it's so new. There are no ways. It's totally different for everyone. As an elected official, have you found that this has made a difference in the way you go about your business at the legislature? The instant access, I think you all have email addresses now. Are the people in the communities contacting you regularly?
I don't get much contact by email. I do get some contact. I still mostly get telephone calls and regular mail. One of the difficulties is that a few House members have their own computers and can use that and send email back to people. But I don't have a computer in my office at the legislature, so it's harder for me to respond. I get a printed out version of the email from my legislative assistant. So
you're not going right in and
right.
responding instantly.
But it is a lot easier to get information about things that are happening that affect what the legislature does. For example, telecommunications on this same topic, the fact that Congress has put up a server that, the Thomas server, that has information on pending bills in Congress, the same way the legislature put up that kind of information, does make it easier to get information that affects how we do our job.
Which ultimately should make it, you'll be able to do a better job because you'll have more information, and that's one of the points that, Mary, you are always talking about. You know, the information we need to be more productive, to be better taxpayers, to be better citizens, and to have richer, fuller lives. That sounds sort of soupy, doesn't it?
Well, I think that the tools of democracy concept that sold the legislature, I mean, I think that term, the tools of democracy, captured a very complex idea, and you could sell the idea because it was captured in those words. I think that's a profound concept, that people do need information to be involved both in the democratic process and also in the economy, and responsible for their own health and their own learning. And
well, and that gets back to a point you were raising, Gretchen, about accountability, because if citizens don't get enough information or can't get enough information about what government is doing, they have a harder job of holding us accountable. And so things like the Thomas server that Congress has put up, or the House's and the Senate's in Minnesota's efforts to make pending bills and things like that available electronically, makes it easier for citizens to be participants in the process and also hold us accountable.
Do you think a lot of people want that, or do you think, are you seeing, of course you're a relative newcomer, you're in your second term, that sometimes people don't want the nuances that go around legislative consensus and debate? They make up their minds, or we make up our minds instantly, this is right or this is wrong. And part of that is the traditional media, I think, takes a stand. And you talked about subscribing to this paper or that magazine. If you only listen to, this is kind of going off the track, but...
Well, but it's the people who are interested in a particular topic, if it's easy, relatively easy, to get the information, will make the effort to get it if they believe they can have an influence on the outcome. So there are two parts to it. There is giving the people a sense of power about their ability to affect the process, but also reducing the cost of getting the information. And that is one thing that this electronic information revolution can do, is lower the cost of getting things out to people so that they don't have a barrier to participation in the process.
And it is easier to email than it is to pick up the phone and call. There's the barrier isn't there of having to talk to somebody.
Right.
But, you know, I have a colleague who says nobody ever has an information need, but people have health needs and, you know, buying car needs, and, you know, you don't go out and say everybody needs information, but everybody does care about taking care of their children.
And maybe that's the way we need to frame this discussion, instead of always talking information, to say, well, especially for people who aren't library users or aren't into technology, we can help you with recipes, we can help you with child care issues, we can help you, you know, find out what they're up to in St. Paul.
And the more that we expect people to assume responsibility for their own health or their own whatever, the more we have to give them the tools. I mean, we have to be concerned about the issue of the tools, not give the tools, but make the tools available so people can be self-sufficient.
Well, I think that's connected to a very important part of this technological revolution, is that it's making clear that people can't rely on teachers or librarians to hand them the information and just be sort of receptacles into which the learning is poured. They have to become more responsible, more participants in their own learning, and that's going to be a hard thing for kids and parents to get used to, is that the kids have to be more responsible for their own learning, and teachers are going to have to adjust to that too.
I think it's going to be hard for the institutions to realize that the people that they've been doing for, or we've been doing for, are self-sufficient.
And again, you mentioned parents, that child coming home and the parents saying, well, what's your homework and what did you learn and what are you expected to do, what do you have to memorize, and that's not going to be the way it is. And those of us who went through school in a time period where that's the way it was, it's hard to see, except it was good enough for me.
And I, thinking about this program, was thinking about the same thing. We want to communicate to our kids that they need to take more responsibility, but I probably haven't done enough of that in my house. So.
Well, now let's not, we're all going to feel guilty. Let's back to the legislature. What kind of things do you anticipate in the future? Do you really think that you're going to sort of make this whole issue of information technology your area of expertise in the legislature? You're not on the education committee. You're on.
I am on the education committee, but I'm not on the education finance committee. I'm on the University of Minnesota division of the education committee. Well, when I was elected in '92, I was looking around for an area to work on, and had some experience through the Citizens League with thinking about the communications future. And so I thought that was an interesting area to get into. But I do have other interests. I'd like to work on property tax reform and some other ways of reforming how the system works that go beyond issues of information and technology.
But it ties in.
Yeah.
Very definitely. And certainly the district you represent is centrally located in Hennepin County and a part of all the discussion of the whole metro area issues that.
The interesting thing for me is that I represent a pretty diverse district. There are some wealthy people and also some very poor people, and we're seeing an increase in the diversity of the folks who live there. And so we've got some of the issues that Minneapolis has coped with, but in Hopkins and St. Louis Park, it's so far on a smaller scale.
Well, I think you've been very active in your community. I think you've been part of some of the collaborative efforts, for instance, that got the Family Resource Center going. And Hopkins as a community, I understand, is really looking very carefully at its assets and looking at ways, for instance, you've been very involved in the Turn Off the Violence campaign, which again is an information kind of thing, helping people to understand that there are other ways to deal with family problems or social problems.
Well, and the information or technological revolution connects with something else I'm interested in, that is, how do we engage citizens more in activities in public life, not just in their private lives. And we need to focus on what things that can be done on the local level that are part of our public lives, that involve citizens locally working on solving local problems. And Turn Off the Violence is an example where, under an umbrella that's statewide and even nationwide, the focus is still local. And a lot of these collaboratives work the same way, give citizens an opportunity to get engaged in solving the problems at the local level.
You've really talked about engagement and about people and about, it's almost a sense of personal responsibility. I think your philosophy is remarkable, because this is the way that this fear or mistrust of government, in my opinion, is going to be eradicated by people thinking that we are partners. I mean, the government is us, and our elected officials not only represent us, but when you're elected, you don't suddenly cross some chasm and you're not involved.
There's some very interesting work being done at the University of Minnesota and other places that trying to encourage people not to think about politics as this totally separate process that has all this money and media attached to it, but that politics is really how we solve our public problems, whether it's locally or at the state level or nationally, and people have a real opportunity to be involved at the local level if they are interested in making the effort. And one of the reforms that the state legislature has to think about is how we shift the power back to citizens in their communities.
And also, since the program does focus on issues affecting children and families, how do you get young people involved? I think the schools are doing a lot of service projects with the idea that young people have responsibilities in their community, but to get more young people involved in the political process, to see it as something that's fun as well as being crucial to the quality of life.
Well, the Center for Citizenship and Democracy has what they call a program called Public Achievement. And it's like junior achievement, only in public achievement, they recruit coaches from colleges or universities who work with junior high or high school students and encourage them to look at problems that occur in areas that affect them and to think about their role in coping with those problems and to see ways that they can work in their communities to practice politics as public problem solving. And I think that's a positive start. I'd love to see more schools involved in that.
And where can people find out information about that?
The Center for Citizenship and Democracy at the Humphrey Institute. It's a university-wide center, but it's located.
Or they can email you.
That's right.
And interestingly enough, the technology has some real role to play there too, because I mean everybody knows that the technology is assumed by young people, and I think they can be a service provider for a lot of us to learn more about the technology. And it isn't just the manipulation of the technology; it's actually how to put it to work and in real problem solving.
Gets kind of boring after a while.
Yeah,
and
that's
do
neither here nor there.
But
But how do you use it now? Now that you got it, what do you do with it? And I think that young people come at it with fresh ideas of how you can solve real problems with the technology.
Hopefully it'll unleash a good deal of creativity.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I would think.
Well, it gets rid of some jobs and leaves your mind free to do other things. And one would hope that problem solving would be, real life problem solving would be some of those other things that you could do with the technology.
Yeah, I guess it's all quite a challenge as we move on to the year 2000. Representative Kelley, thank you very much for being here today. Obviously, we just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of discussing this issue. And Mary Treacy, once again, your ideas on libraries and information literacy just stimulate more questions. I'm going to go straight upstairs and get onto the internet.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Gretchen.
You're welcome. Thanks.
It's exciting to talk with a legislator who sees the connection between libraries and the exciting world of information. Thank you, Representative Kelley, Mary Treacy. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.